Hello everybody, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, and today I'm going to handle a theme that was requested from one of our listeners, and that is the minority attack in the Queen's Gambit Declined. The Queen's Gambit Declined, in my opinion, is Black's most solid defensive weapon against 1d4. And as such, if White wants to break it, he has to have a number of ideas at his disposal. The minority attack, I think, is just one of those. Now, let me list off those ideas. I think there's basically three. Okay? The first and most important thing when facing the Queen's Gambit Decline is to realize that the biggest problem for Black is going to be this bishop on c8. That's a bad bishop. And a lot of the game is going to revolve around White trying to prevent that bishop from coming out and Black trying to get it out. Okay? So that's one key factor that we're going to have to use as White. The next factor is that in a lot of positions we'll get a pawn structure like this, and this is called the Carlsbad structure, where Black has an extra pawn on the queen's head and we have an extra pawn in the center. And a key plan for White is going to be to sometimes use that extra pawn in the center, oftentimes with a slow advance like e3, f3, and then e4, trying to dominate the center. A key plan for White to try to beat Black. Okay, the next weapon for White is the minority attack. Okay, and we're going to focus on that today. But what I want to stress is that really what you want to be thinking about is that you want to use a combination of all of those three plans. The fact that the bishop's bad, using your extra pawn in the center, and this thing called the minority attack, which we're about to look at. So let's try to look at the minority attack just from the perspective of the pawns. So when we take here, and Black takes back, and we get this thing called the Carlsbad structure, what White can do is use minority on the queen's side, these two pawns, to try to induce a weakness by Black. Okay, so let's say b4, and one of the key responses that Black can play here is c6. And in general, he's going to have to play this move at some point to protect his pawn on d5. Now, the key idea of the minority attack is to then push b5. And the important thing to realize is that a number of different structures can now arise, but they're basically all favorable for White. Let's take a look at a few of them. If Black just sits on his position, then we can take, and this will be a bad pawn structure for Black. He has a weak pawn on c6 and a hole on c5. And that's what would make this pawn on c6 what we'd call a backward pawn, because it can't really advance and it can't be defended from behind. So that's one way things could develop. Again, d5, another way for Black to deal with things, depending on the situation, is going to be c5. But in that case, these pawns are going to get traded, and Black will be left with an isolated pawn. So again, a situation that Black can't see as too desirable. Okay, now the third thing that can happen is on b5 to take on b5. And in general, I think this is probably Black's worst decision he can make, because now this pawn on b5 will fall, and the pawn on d5 here will become an incredible weakness, and will be very hard for Black to defend. Note that if you just contrast the two sides, White will get a pawn on e3. He'll be super strong. On the king side, he really has no weaknesses. Black, in the meantime, will have a weakness on d5. Okay, let me just mention a couple more things about this structure. Now, one thing that can happen, and often does happen, is let's say White just plays e3. We can imagine a bunch of pieces on the board. And Black says, okay, I'm going to stop you, and I'm going to play a6. Now what usually happens then is white can just play a4, and still we're going to be looking if black just waits to play b5. And the important thing to realize is that pawn weakness on c6 is still going to occur. And a lot of times it's really even to black's disadvantage to open things up like this on the king-queen side, because it just opens up more lines. But sometimes a very useful thing for black to do, especially if he can open up a black rook on a8. Another key plan for black in positions like this is to try to meet white's onslaught with b5. Now clearly he's left with a pawn on c6 that's undefended, but especially if the position becomes closed in nature and that pawn can be defended by a bishop, by a bad bishop, then this is often a very nice structure for black, especially if he can get, say, a knight on d7, they can travel to b6 and c4. That can be very productive for black, because then the knight on c4 will block any attack upon the c6 knight on the file, on the c file, where it's most vulnerable. So there's a number of ways to counteract that strategy. For example, after a position like this on b5, white will often look to play e4, a very complex maneuvering game. And in general, what I'd like to say is about the Queen's Gambit decline is that it's different than a lot of other openings, and that a lot of other openings you're thinking about variations and lines that a lot of people have looked at and memorized and analyzed. But the Queen's Gambit decline is really about ideas. And we see in the ways in which black can deal with the minority attack that he has a lot of different ideas and ways to go about things, and a lot of choices. And a lot of that's going to depend upon how black sees his own pieces being affected in this pawn structure. Remember, playing for pawn structure is a good thing, but it's important not to be dogmatic about it. Much more important than pawn structure is the placement of your pieces. And for that, I'd like to look at a couple example games. Okay, so in our first example game, we're going to look at the opening phase of a game which used the minority attack. And this game is Philippe against Sabo, 1953. So we have a standard opening. White goes immediately into the Carlsbad structure. Queen c2. Now, one thing I should say here is that what white is doing is he's trying to prevent black from developing his bishop on the most natural square. And the funny thing is, in this very kind of variation, is that even though black now has a full diagonal for his bishop, he still can't find that comfortable of a place to put him on. So that bishop, even though it's gained some freedom, is still a bad piece. And that's a very anti-intuitive thing. But that's what white is working with now with Queen c2. Okay, Rook e8. All just kind of normal things. Rook a b1. So white initiates the minority attack. Now b4. g6. Kind of a strange move. Blocks the diagonal of the bishop, but we'll see it actually has a different idea, and that involves black trading off his bishop on c8. So b4, knight e6, bishop h4. And now I think black makes a big mistake here. I think what he should do here is follow the original plan, and we'll look at this in game 2, of knight g7 and bishop f5, trying to trade off his bad piece. As it is, with knight h5, now white gets to trade off black's best piece, his dark square bishop. And now this is what I want to talk about in this position. Now white is going to get the standard advantage with the minority attack, plus he now has a difficult piece to work with, the bishop on c8. And what's really important when you do the minority attack is not to be dogmatic about it. Don't think that that's just what's going on in the position. It's important to see that really it's much more global, and really you need two weaknesses, one induced by the minority attack and some other kind of weakness, like a bad bishop. Okay, white plays knight a4, and this is illustrative of the fact that we can now use the square on c5 even before we push our pawn to b5. And white is now in no hurry. And I think we can stop here. We're going to see that white's going to play b5, and a weakness is going to be induced, and all of his pieces are standing great, and this bishop in particular on c8 isn't doing anything. Play progress like this. White plays rook c3, rook c1, b5, and the piece on e8 is awful. Okay, so let's look at a different game, one which went slightly better for black. Here, I think white's close to winning because he has two weaknesses. One, which is going to be induced by b5, and the other in the fact that bishop on e8 is bad. Okay, let's look at another opening phase, and this is the game Kotos against Pac-Man 1950. And standard opening. This developing as a Nimzo Indian, but after knight c3, black decides not to play bishop b4 and plays d5. Bishop g5, bishop e7, e3, castle, a6. So black's idea with a6 is a little bit tricky. He's dreaming of playing d takes c, followed by b5, activating his bishop on c8. Remember, that's going to be black's main goal, is to activate the bishop on c8. But also he's thinking that that pawn on a6 might also be useful because it'll help slow down the minority attack when it comes with b4 and b5. White takes. So a3, white initiates the minority. Knight e6, the same time as before. And this plan, just to say it historically, was introduced by Stoltenberg. Very original idea of maneuvering his pieces around just to solve the problem of the bishop on c8. I took. A-B, bishop f5. Bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, pawn takes. So, what I want to say about this position is that here I think white still has the advantage, but it's important to see the big differences with the game before. In this position, black's preserved his best piece, the bishop on f6, and this bishop will help fight for the dark squares around these two pawns. And it's those squares upon which white wants to blockade those pawns that black needs to fight for. So here, even though white has an advantage, black should have enough to hold. And so the principle is, I'll say it again, is that with the minority attack, you're looking to create two weaknesses, not just one that's induced with the minority attack. Okay, let's look at another position. Okay, as another example, I'd like to take a look at a kind of topical variation in the Queen's Gambit decline. So d4, d5. Okay, so b6, the Bondaresky-Makagana variation. Definitely black's most reliable way of defending against this classical setup. He simply wants to solve the problem of his bishop. So, one way that white can play, though there are many, is to do something like this. Bishop e2, bishop b7, and now actually to take that knight and play cd. The point is this bishop on f6 isn't so active, and that knight on f6 would have taken back on d5 and given black a nice game after cd. In this case, we now have a chance to play a different form of minority attack, e4. So, even here, what it's important to notice is that even though the pawn structure is different, instead of it being the pawns being on c6 and b7, we have them now on b6 and c7. Even though it's different, really a lot of the same principles of the minority attack apply. So in this position, white has really a decisive positional threat that black has to guard against. If white plays b5 without black stopping him, this pawn on d5 will be permanently isolated. There'll be no way for him to be protected by another pawn, because any time the c pawn moves, the white pawn will take it. So black needs to do something about it now. One way to deal with it is to play c5, but then after bc, bc, and maybe a move like rook b1, white stands good, and the pawns on d5 and c5 are going to be a little bit weak. This is a variation that's been tested many times, and like almost all variations of the Queen's Gambit declined, the best really white can hope for is some kind of small advantage like this. Another way for black to deal with it, a more dynamic way, is to play c6, which at first seems totally ridiculous, but the point is simply to retain the flexibility in the position. And now, if white plays b5, black can simply answer c5, and his pawns are whole. So, in this position, all kinds of plans can happen. There's a really big strategical fight is going to now ensue. Black's going to play rook e8, knight d7, and the whole time, white has to be careful about black either playing c5, or a lot of times, like I said when I was talking about the position with just the pawns, he can play a move like b5 and shut down a lot of white's offensive possibilities with then a maneuver like knight d7, knight b6, knight c4. And so this is a very rich strategical position where a definite advantage hasn't yet been procured, but it's clear that the pawns, black's pawns, are definitely a little bit funny. Okay? And black's always going to have some little pawn weakness in all of these Queen's Gambit decline positions. But the important thing is to use more than one plan. Okay, so as an example of using more than one plan, I'd like to look at one final opening phase. Okay, this next game is from the game Kasparov-Short in the World Championship game match in 1993. And it started off like this. One thing actually I'm going to just note as a footnote here is that there are obviously many different ways for black to play the Queen's Gambit declined, and there's a lot of move orders. And of course, he doesn't have to play the Queen's Gambit declined. He can play the Noteboom variation, which Mark Deason's talked about on his site, or he can play the Slav defense, which we've also talked about on the site. He can transfer to a Stonewall. He can do many different things. And what I really think is a good supplement to anyone studying against the Queen's Gambit declined and all these structures that the Queen's Gambit accepted is to look at David Vigorito's transpositional guide to the d4 openings. One thing he taught me is that if you're facing someone who likes to play the Queen's Gambit accepted, then c4 is really a dirty trick, because then they can't really do it. c4 on the first move. Okay. So let's look at this game, knight c3. This is the most aggressive move order for white. And the reason is he hasn't moved his knight on g1. Now the importance of the fact that he hasn't moved the knight on g1 yet is that he hasn't therewith blocked in the pawn on f2. And remember, that was one of the key plans I said that white had. It was to advance his pawn to f3 and then use it to help force through e4. So this game went knight f6, cd, ed, bishop 5, bishop e7, e3, castle. e7, knight ge2. Okay, rook e8, castles. So you can imagine yourself in Short's position here, facing Kasparov, who's won many nice games playing the plan f3 and e4. A game to look at, very instructive, is this game against Ulf Andersson, where he won very nicely with this central strategy in the 80s. So what Short did was he said to himself, well, look, if White's going to play f3, e4, I'm not sure I want to waste time by playing the move c6. Excuse me. c6. Because then, really, when he plays e4, I want to be in a position to play c5. So if I wait with c6, I can maybe get c5 in one move. And once he has that pawn on e4, c5 would be a good square for the pawn because it would really challenge White's center. So what Black did here was he played knight f8. Makes sense. We'll delay c6, and maybe we can get c5 in one shot when White goes for this f3, e4 plan. So basically what we see happening is Black is defending against one thing, the kingside advance, f3 and e4, but what happens here is he gets hit with another, b4, an amazing move. So first of all, the point is that after bishop f6, bishop takes b4 rather, White can play bishop takes f6. And if he doubles his pawns, there's this rather amazing maneuver. Knight takes pawn, queen takes, and queen a4. Hitting both the bishop and the rook. So, what happened here was now Black allowed White to get in b4 with extra time. And what I mean by that is normally White would have to play something like rook b1 or a3 like we saw in the previous games to prepare it. But now, due to this tactical trick, White gets it in one move. And it's important to see here really that even in this pawn structure where Black hasn't committed anything yet, neither b6 or c6, b4 is still a very strong move in terms of the minority attack. Because if we get our pawn to b5, then this pawn, again, will have problems. Now Black can defend it at any point with c6, but then he gets one of the poor strong pawn structures that we've been talking about. So in this game, for example, Short played a6, and it slows him down, but really now he has a clamp on the queen side, and Kasparov played a very nice move here. He just played a3, and now he actually played again with two plans, both threatening to advance on the queen side and playing for f3, e4 in the king side. And combining those two strategies, Black found it impossible to defend against both. And that's going to be key to beating the Queen's Gambit declined, is using both of those strategies at given points to make your opponents confused and unable to defend against both. It's similar to the doctrine of two weaknesses. Okay, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, hoping you've enjoyed this introduction to the minority attack in the Queen's Gambit declined. Bye-bye.